Welcome to Accelerate Your Wealth, a podcast by Rebecca Robertson, founder and director of Evolution Financial Planning. This series, we're focusing on female financial independence, looking towards a stronger financial future. Be sure to let us know your thoughts on the show, and please do connect with us on Facebook, LinkedIn or Instagram, or head over to www.rebeccarobertson.co.uk.
So excited to have Caroline here today. She's one of those people that I've followed online because I love what she's doing and how she's doing it. And I love how excuse my language, you obviously give a shit. You obviously care about what it is you're doing. So welcome today.
Thank you for having me.
No, so excited to have this conversation, but we've got to try and sort of keep it within a certain time frame, because I feel like I could talk to you for such a long time about this subject. But let's start a little bit about you and your background being that what you've been through personally. So from what I can see from the bio, that you've had a narcissistic marriage yourself, accumulating over $100,000 or pounds in debt, and losing your family home. So this is something that I imagine created a lot of anxiety. I can see you had PTSD from this, depression, self-harm. So this is something that you've personally experienced, overcome, and now you're helping others, which I just think's like amazing. Well done for getting through that for a start.
If you'd have said it to me 10 years ago, or even, I certainly wasn't that sort of 7-year-old little girl saying this is what I want to do kind of thing. And certainly again, 10 years ago, it wasn't something that I would ever think that I would be doing now, but I definitely feel it is my purpose to be doing this right now. But yeah, it was really tough. I mean, I was brought up on those ladybird storybooks, happily ever after. And I know we were talking before we came on air as well about, my mum and dad were very traditional. We always lived in an overdraft, but my dad worked, my mum stayed at home. But they still wanted, I've got 2 older sisters, it was still very much sort of academics. My mum was still driven that she always wanted us as women to have something to fall back on. But even when I look back, even at that stage as well, Rebecca, it was, I loved the medical profession. For me, anything on the TV, I just was obsessed with it, all of that. I still am in some respects. And so I was looking at things to do, but at no point was it ever expected that I'd be a doctor. It was always about what came up was podiatry, physio, occupational therapy, because it would be good when you have children and you can be at home. So already that conditioning was, the woman's role is at home, but you can work, but you can kind of, it's not as important, say, as the man. So they were all the sort of conditioning elements. And, my dad was a very unemotional person. I was always seeking approval, never getting it, even though I was this high achieving student, captain of the sports teams. When I look back, I think, oh my God, how more of a perfect daughter I could have been, so to speak. And my mum was highly codependent. So my mum's sense of worth came from being a mum to me and my sisters. And being the youngest, I felt that the most, because when they left home, I was the one giving my mum a sense of worth. So the dynamic then of our family as I grew up, and of course I didn't realize any of this until I did my own healing, because I thought I had a great childhood. I was fed, I was clothed, my mum loved me, my dad was still there working, earning the money. But that really shaped then the types of relationships that I would be attracted to, because I had this real people-pleasing part of myself that I wanted others to validate and show
totally
me.
Get it. I totally get it. I don't hide the fact that my parents broke up when I was really young. So we're talking like I was just over 1 year old, and I was brought up by my grandparents. And my parents, it's really hard for me to say mum and dad, because that's how weird it would be for them to be in the same sentence. They were never in the same room for over 30 years. And with that came a lot of complexities and a lot of having to learn body language and understand like when to back off and when to say things and what to say and not what to say to one person and not the other one. And although I had an okay childhood, there's so many things that now as an adult I look back and think, wow, that's quite tough. That's quite hard to have to handle all that. And I think we've all got a story, right, in that respect.
you know, and as we are growing up, our attachments to our caregivers and parents, those around us, really shape then what we feel about ourselves, which then impacts the types of relationships we end up having as we become adults. And you know, certainly for me, you know, I don't even know how sometimes my mum and dad did stay together, because again, they slept in separate rooms, and it was just, you know, it was almost like, but their generation, they're not going to get a divorce, so to speak. And don't get me wrong, I know they will have had their moments together and of tenderness and things, but you know, for me, seeing that, it felt like they were there mechanically to bring up a family, and they had their roles, and you know, not necessarily the love for each other. So,
and also like it almost like what you feel towards what you want and what you want your life to look like is way down the list of priorities. Like the family unit and, you know, everybody else and everything to follow that particular box is more important than actually what you want from life.
Absolutely. And seeing how my mum was as the woman, that became then, well, that's what a woman needs to do. You know, you need to please everybody else and wear it with a badge of honor that you're pleasing everybody else.
Oh God, yeah.
And then with my dad, it was, well, I'm trying to get approval from him and never receiving it. But then that became my norm of a relationship with a man. That's how it should be, because my dad's meant to love me. So that's what a loving relationship should look like. Me feeling like I need to prove myself. And all of those, you know, nuances and, like you say, complexities of those relationships as they transcend into adulthood. You know, when I look back, don't get me wrong, I've had some great friends along the way, but I've had some real toxic friendships. I've had toxic relationships with men, culminating in, obviously I married my ex-husband sort of when I was about 26, 27. We went on to have my son. Didn't really recognize anything was necessarily wrong, even though when I look back, even on my wedding day, I remember looking out of the window at him, because we were in this like manor house, and thinking, am I doing the right thing here? Oh, everybody's here. Of course. Yep. So even then I knew my gut, because we have more messages from our gut to our brain than our brain to our body. Even then there was still something, but I overrode it and everything else and got into that relationship, and we became married. And over that period of time when I was married, and again, I didn't realize this until I came out of the relationship, that when we had our son, it was, again, I was kind of following that traditional kind of, you know, getting married, having children. And the interesting thing was as well, when we were talking about finances, I was earning more than my ex-husband when we had our son. You know, we were both at the time working for the same company, and I was higher up than he was and earning more money, but I wanted to be at home because of the conditioning that I had. But I still knew I was an ambitious woman. So I did felt this kind of, you know,
pull, isn't it? It's quite difficult.
Guilt, but, you know, actually, no, I need to give up work. And actually, I actually ended up taking who I work for to a tribunal for sex discrimination. And I did dismissal as such, but that's another podcast for all of that. But then obviously I was a stay-at-home mum then, totally reliant on my ex-husband for paying the bills, the finances and everything else. And, you know, and I was very aware of all of that. I felt almost, you know, and I didn't realize it at the time, but I was trapped almost. So over that time, after we had my son, I started to have these multiple miscarriages then as well. And then eventually I had 4 miscarriages. And then I fell pregnant with my now daughter. And 6 months into my pregnancy with our daughter, I found out that he was having an affair. Wow. So at that stage, 6 months pregnant, got a son, financially reliant on him. We've got a home. What do? I mean, I couldn't even go out and get drunk or anything. You know, I couldn't even go and do that. And it was just kind of like, well, and of course he was saying sorry, etc., as he would. So I thought, well, let's just try, you know. But I really feel from that moment there was a light that really went out with me. And when I look back from that point, we weren't intimate from that moment. That was that from conceiving our daughter. That was it. Nothing from then. And over those coming years, and it was years. there was just something not right. He worked for an airline as cabin crew, so he was away a lot. So I felt almost like I was a single mum a lot of the time anyway. I felt very isolated. I was wearing grey clothes, black clothes. I didn't like looking in the mirror. I'd put on weight, obviously, from having children. So I felt disgusted with myself. I knew my husband had an affair. I was presuming he was probably having more because I was questioning on things, and then he'd get angry at me for questioning and the manner in which is obviously gaslighting at that stage, making me feel like I'm the crazy one. So I did what my mum did. I threw myself into being a mum, and that was my life. And it was only what I did at university. I was a podiatrist, so I was a sort of lower limb foot doctor kind of thing. I started to do some home visits just to earn some of my own money, but it wasn't a huge amount by any stretch of the imagination, but it kept my hand in and everything else. And in 2009, my mum died very, very suddenly, literally out of the blue. My rock, the one who... So my mum definitely created the need in me to need her. So even though I was an adult at that stage, I was sort of in my late 30s at that stage, I knew that I'd always got my mum there. So even though I'd been through this with my husband and everything else, my mum was still my rock, because my mum needed to be my rock, because that still gave her that sense of worth.
Of course.
So when my mum passed away, it was like this rug had been pulled from under me, that I still had this need to need someone, which was my mum at the time. That need hadn't disappeared. And then there I was with my husband, who was, you know, goodness knows what he was doing. My dad, who is unemotional. I've got a sister in America. My other sister's great, but again, fairly unemotional at that time too. So I felt very alone. I felt very isolated. And for that kind of following year after my mum passed away, I was looking after my dad because he decided to get 2 new knees. So again, my focus was on looking after him. I know, crazy, typical father thing as such, but I understand, because he was trying to distract himself, and that as well. I get that. And then a year after that, me and my husband, things weren't right between us by any stretch. And he kept leaving for work early, saying he was staying with a friend, and he hated seeing me this unhappy, you know, all the usual things. So I was just kind of getting on again, being a mum, but feeling very low about myself. But my sense of worth, like my mum, was being a mum. That's what, you know, the pattern was repeating itself. And then I remember one Saturday, I'd gone out and done a home visit for a patient of mine. And when I came back, my husband said, "Tell the kids I'm leaving early, but I'm leaving." And I don't know what it was. I remember it was on a Saturday as well. For some reason, I just said, "Yes, you are, but you're telling the children this time." Now, our daughter, who wasn't quite 3 at the time, she was actually having a nap. And my son, who was nearly 6, so he called our son in and literally told our son. He fell to his knees going, "No," like them. It was heartbreaking to see.
Oh.
And literally my husband walked out, literally got his stuff and left. And so I'm there then trying to pick up the pieces I couldn't even call anybody. But the one thing going through my mind at that stage, bizarrely, wasn't like, I've lost the love of my life.
No.
Bizarrely, it was, how the hell am I going to survive financially? What the hell? We've got a house together. Obviously, he left the home at that stage, but what was going to happen? My worth was being a mum. I was a single mum now. My kids were in a broken home now. All those words we hear in society.
Which is
ashamed. I felt alone. And I remember then on the Monday calling up everybody, my utilities, council tax, you know, everybody. And they were great, actually. I think I managed to shave about £200 off my bills and everything. But I didn't know how much debt we were in at that stage. I knew we were in some debt, because lots of families are. And it was only over the coming weeks that when I was working it all out, it was over £70,000 worth of debt, of which 23,000 was in my name. Now, I was earning a few £100 a month at that stage, living in a house with a £1,600 mortgage. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do here? I do not know.
And that fear, like you didn't walk away because you knew that already, right? So if you'd have been in a position where, I don't know, you were earning, I don't know, a couple of grand a month, you'd think, actually, this relationship is not worth my time, and your self-worth, even if it might not be perfect, would be that much more, because you had a little bit of your own independence. And this is why I do what I do, to enable women, so that if they are in a relationship they don't want to be in anymore, you're not having to retrospectively go through that another form of trauma. It's like a double form of financial trauma because of the position that you're in. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I don't want everyone to feel like I'm being judgmental. I'm not. I know we all make choices, and we need to make, stick with them. And if we want to be a stay-at-home mum, then I completely respect that. But for me, I was made redundant when I was pregnant with Emily, who's 13 now. And it was literally 6 months before the recession hit in financial services in 2008. So for me to get another job was impossible. So there I am, like heavily pregnant, trying to get another job, couldn't get one. And I ended up having what's called a thyroidectomy, where I had half my thyroid removed, where I have like a 9-inch scar on my neck where they removed part of my thyroid. And I had massive symptoms like depression, like postnatal depression, but it wasn't, it was hormone based. And I went from being, my badge of honor, a bit like yourself, had this great job. I was a regional sales manager. I earned more than my husband did, and going to being just a mum. I was just a mum. And when I tried to get back into work again, all my family was, just go working a bank, Becky, go back to working as a cashier in a bank. And I've got a whole story around that, but put it this way, I walked out a couple of interviews crying. I wasn't in a place. So I totally get that place where you're not feeling yourself, you're not feeling your normal confidence. I know I was wearing pinstripe TM Lewin suits and shirts, and with cufflinks in London, so as a top regional manager, going to being not even able to get a cashier job in a bank because my confidence was completely knocked. And I think for me, when I came out the other side of that and I started my business 10 years ago, that's been such a driver for me to empower women with their finances, so that if you choose to want to be in a situation to be financially independent and you don't want to rely on another partner, male or female, and you want to be financially independent, but you choose to have children in that process, then that's absolutely fine as well. That's a new way of thinking and new way of living. But what could we be doing? Because your decision at that point would have been very different, I imagine, had you been financially even slightly more independent.
I don't know. I actually probably don't think it would have been at that particular point, because of when you're involved in an abusive relationship, you have a trauma bond. So although, if I was earning more, then maybe, but the likelihood is my drive over wanting to make sure that my kids were happy and in a home with both parents, because that's what I believe to be the norm and the right thing. I probably wouldn't have done that, to be fair, at that stage, because of the addiction of being in that relationship, because that was a normal relationship to me that took me back to my childhood and everything as well. And what happens when we're talking about trauma, so our brain's number one job is to keep us safe, alive, and in the least amount of pain. So if I'm in that relationship, and my ex-husband was a covert narcissist, if I'm in that relationship,
what do you mean by covert? Like that's like SAS kind of like
it is. It's a very
secret.
It is. He acts very victim-like, almost like it's kind of he's the victim in all of this. So he wasn't that typical overt narcissist that you would think, that grandiose walk in the room, hey, look at me.
Right.
He was very much a covert, what we call somatic narcissist. So very much how he looked was very important to him. He changed clothes a lot every single day. And it was very covert. So which makes it very hard then for people with a covert narcissist, because to the outside world, it looks perfect.
Yeah.
Behind closed doors, there's a lot of covert abuse going on, gaslighting, manipulation, behavioral elements to all of that. So, that again made it really challenging, because to the outside world, we look like this perfect, idyllic family. So just again, behind closed doors of asking questions and being told different answers, looking you in the eye when you think that's not true, but actually you start questioning your own sanity and feeling like you're the crazy one, you're the sensitive one, and everything as well. And sort of going back to that element of safety with the brain's job of being safe in the least amount of pain, me being in some relationship, so with my ex-husband, to my brain felt safer than not being. So it's almost like, because I had those feelings of not feeling good enough that had come from being obviously my dad's behavior as a child. So that kind of created an inner child wound for me of I'm not good enough, because I felt like whatever I was doing to my dad wasn't good enough, because my interpretation of my dad's behavior was he's behaving like that because I'm not good enough, not
Right.
he's behaving like that because of his childhood. You know, you don't have that cognitive capacity.
No, we don't. No.
Recognize that. So that kind of created that inner child wound of I'm not good enough. So I would have all of these protector parts coming up, like people pleasing, high achieving, you know, all of those to try and prove my sense of worth, to get that praise, to get that recognition, to soothe the wound of not being good enough. So when I'm in that relationship with a narcissist and I'm trying to prove my worth all of the time, that's normal to me. That's a normal relationship for me to be in. That's what my brain knows. And my brain knows, well, being in this relationship, yeah, you might not be happy, but you're alive and you're safe because you were alive and safe as a kid. So we know it's an okay relationship for you to be in. Every cell of my body recognizes that it's familiar, so it's safe. So every time then, if I think about leaving, for instance, my whole system is like, no way, we don't know, that could be even more dangerous. And if you're not with anyone, well, yeah, you are really not good enough then, aren't you? So it's almost like those breadcrumbs of love that I would be getting off my husband at the time, to my brain and system and body is like, it's better than nothing. Because if you're not with anything, then my God, that wound is going to bleed like crazy. And this is why when we see women in these abusive relationships and other people, just leave them, just ignore, just go. This is when people aren't trauma informed. They don't understand the dynamics of, actually, it feels safer for them to be in the relationship. Than to leave. Now, that might seem crazy to somebody else, but we don't know what has gone on in their past, their childhood, their relationships previously, to create that wound, that it feels safer to be in that relationship. And actually, most murders, homicides happen in the first 7 days of leaving an abusive relationship as well.
That's very true. I know that to be fact, because the lady who spoke to said the same thing.
Yeah,
it's actually most of the domestic abuse in terms of then leading to murder. They did a specialist case of 50 most recent murders. So they could create like a tool, a support tool for going forward for women that would report it to the police. And yeah, the majority was after the event. So actually leaving, and the process of leaving is actually, you have to do very carefully.
Yes, you know, safe. I volunteer at the local domestic abuse charity, and safety is the priority with this. You have to create that safe space to be able to leave. But very often people feel safer in it and don't want to leave as such. Now, they will know cognitively on some level, this is not a good relationship. I knew it wasn't a good relationship. And this is why, if you're trying to say to people, well, even if you're trying to do it in a beautiful, loving, compassionate way, you know, just leave, let's just go. What happens is, if they still feel safer in that relationship, just like I did, and you've got family, friends intentionally trying to support you, saying, just go, and then you don't go, you're going to carry on saying to yourself, oh, I really am not even good enough for my friends and family now, because they're telling me to go and I'm not going. And what happens is that wound starts bleeding even more. You're still in the relationship anyway, and you start to isolate and retreat even more, which is exactly what I did as well. I would isolate myself, you know, I wouldn't go out much. And again, it was very difficult because of my husband's job at the time too, because of childcare, and my mum wasn't around. I didn't want to ask my dad. So, you know, any social life was quite limited. It was more around mums of, you know, kids and stuff like this, but I would still put on a front, but I'd be in grey tracksuits all of the time, literally. You know, it's a standing joke now with my kids, we talk about my grey tracksuits and stuff and everything, because I wanted to be invisible. I felt worthless. You know, for the most of my 30s, I was in what we call functional freeze. So I was totally dissociated, totally numbed out. I was literally existing, functioning as a mum, because that's the job I needed to do to get at least some sense of worth, still trying on occasion to, you know, get my marriage working and everything else. And then when the relationship ended, my wound was bleeding, even though cognitively I was kind of like, well, now that's given me the green light. I didn't leave, badge of honor. He left me, kind of thing. You know, that's not necessarily a good thing, I hasten to add, you know, but in my wisdom at the time, I thought it was better for the children, you know. And again, we can't judge people for staying, going, whatever.
Really not. No, we don't know the people's circumstances.
Absolutely. Yeah. So then when I left and I found out we were in all of this debt, it was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? And that whole thing of, I don't want to put my kids in full-time childcare, because that meant I'm a bad mum, right? And that would then highlight a wound of not being a good enough mum. So I've got all of these things of, I needed money, but I wanted to be at home, but I needed to work, but I actually childcare costs. So it was all of these. And I ended up being stuck in this tax credit trap here in the UK, where I was doing a set amount of hours. And even if I did more, I'd actually lose less because of childcare, because of what I'd lose for tax credits. So I kind of worked out what I needed to do hour-wise to get the most money I could whilst I was working to try and survive in some way. But I'd have letters coming through my door. I'd put them in the bin. I didn't open them. I just totally buried my head. I didn't have the capacity to deal with it. You know, I was suffering with complex PTSD, depression, anxiety. Every morning I'd wake up and go and sit on my bathroom floor, desperately trying not to have a panic attack. Sometimes I'd win, sometimes I wouldn't. Before I got my children up for school, I used to literally use the end of the toothpaste on the top of my thighs. And now I know, because I use parts therapy and what I do, I use internal family systems, that for me, the pain on my leg when I did that was a great distractor from the pain of feeling not good enough, which is what my brain and body thought was the worst pain. So everything for me was about distracting me away from not feeling good enough and worthless. So you have all of these protector parts, which very often can be destructive protector parts, but they're all there with a good intention. You know, we often look at people's behaviors or our own behaviors and think, I don't want to feel like this, I don't want to behave like this. But actually they are all there with a loving intention, albeit very often a destructive impact. And when we understand then that they're only there to protect you from feeling what your system thinks is the most pain, we can start to work and we can start to process that trauma of, well, why did that wound why did my wound of I'm not good enough actually start in the first place? And we want to process that through, not just cognitively, but through the body. So a lot of the work I do is in the body as well, because it's so important. If we're working with trauma, we have to process that through the body. We have to work somatically to do that, because otherwise we're only working on the front part of the brain, which is 10%, the logical, rational part. Emotion overrides logic every single, however much we're like, I'm not going to eat that cake. The moment you get triggered and someone might make you feel not good enough, chomp, 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 we're going to demolish the cake, so to speak. And that's how our system works. And it's it's amazing how we operate as human beings. But knowing then that I was this mum, my kids were in a broken home, single, and I'd got no money, I'd got more money going out than coming in.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. I hear a lot of women that, when I first started 10 years ago, I wasn't a financial advisor. I was a financial planner, non-investment. So I did a lot of mortgages, a lot of remortgaging. I spoke to a lot of doing mortgage capacity letters for women that are getting divorced. And so it's slightly different now, where I do more investment things, but my team still hear the same stuff. And obviously, working previously in the industry for so long, that's what you're describing is just it's so typical for women that are been in a relationship, they've separated, because it's like a paradigm of the way things were. And I hope to think, and I really do wish it, that our daughters will have a different set of foundation to work from. And I can see that now. I can always see that in my daughter. She's got, for a start, they've got different role models, right? They've got a different role model in itself. And that was an interesting conversation with a lady the other day, which is precisely that we have to, it's not about whether you're happy in the relationship or unhappy in the relationship, or if the children are okay or they're not going to be okay. At the end of the day, what role model are you setting? What standard example are you giving? And you've just explained that beautifully by your set of circumstances that's rolled out in your life, is that your parents thought they were doing the best thing. And actually the role model that they gave you was actually giving you the wrong impression, and unintentionally.
Correct. And I think that's the thing. It's because we do live in a very judgmental society, and I think, I look at my parents, my dad's still here as well, and I look at them with so much love and compassion, because they did do the best that they could with what they were then taught and given. And I think, when we talk about healing and being role models, it has to start with ourselves first and foremost. We have to work on ourselves first to be that role model, because no matter then, you want the best for your children. It's like the old oxygen mask on an aeroplane. You've got to put it on yourself first. The best gift you can give to your children is self-love, for you to role model that to your children. Because when you do that, and then you start operating from a place of safety and your own true self, you see things very differently as such, and then your children will see things very differently. You know, you're not almost parenting coming from a protector part of anger, frustration, dissociation, hurt. You know, you're coming from a place of your true self. So, you know, you're really working in those different elements. And I know, you know, certainly for me, I remember in sort of 2013 when I in the June of that year I hit 40, and in the April of that year I'd had my home repossessed. I couldn't afford it at all. My ex wasn't I get £97 a month from my ex, and he's full time with an airline. I mean, it's crazy. It's, or, you know, still going through stuff, and that not because I need the money now, thank goodness, but because of the principle of it. And I just remember thinking, oh my God, I am 40 years old. I own nothing. I have no assets. I'm working a very, very part-time job as a podiatrist. You know, I've got a qualification as such, but I still wasn't earning any money. I was relying on the state for child tax credits, or universal credits as they are now. And I felt really ashamed. I felt, how could I have a life like this? What happened, Caroline? What the hell happened for you to be a single mom, bringing your kids up? You've lost your home. You're in this rented. I mean, luckily it's always a nice rented.
I almost want to give this Caroline a cuddle. I don't recognise this Caroline. The lady sitting in front of me now.
Yeah, and I feel real compassion, because boy, was I judging myself. Oh my.
Well, we do that though, right? We beat ourselves up so much more than what we you know, we love everybody else around us so much more than what the love we give ourselves.
Because we're seeking that external approval and validation, because that will go back to a childhood wound. You know, we're looking for other things. You know, I was this 40-year-old woman really coming from a 7-year-old little girl's space, and even at that stage as well, I was waiting, because of my conditioning, for a knight in shining armor on this white horse to come charging in to rescue me, because that's what men did to women, wasn't it? That's what should happen. Here I was now as this woman, as this mum. And, you know, yes, I'd gone through a divorce, but then, right, where's the man now to come in and rescue me? Because that's what is meant to happen, because that's how it should be. Man, woman, you know, or woman, man, you know, to kind of have the relationship. And so that it's this joint thing to rescue yourself. And I remember sitting there, it was like this crossroads in my life that I thought, I can either keep on feeling like this and sit in this space of blaming everybody else, you know, getting angry at everybody else for, you know, for nobody coming to rescue me, so to speak, or go and rescue yourself, Caroline. And that felt incredibly hard to do. It felt like, you know, someone was saying to me, go and climb Mount Everest, or just take the nice easy route and stay where you are, blaming everybody and being angry, because that's exactly what it felt like. And when you're healing trauma, that it can feel like, nope, don't want to go there, because the brain thinks it would be more painful to go down that route. And of course it knows this other route because it's familiar.
It's much easier to be negative, isn't it, than positive? It takes 10 times more energy.
It's what we know. And my body was filled with neural pathways of negativity, and you know, people had let me down, and I was playing this same old story to myself about all of that.
I'm intrigued to know how you went from being so ashamed of yourself, and I'm really shocked in almost the venom, the way you described that feeling to yourself.
I really did.
To where you are now. Like, okay, we all have a journey, but that's a leap in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, I think towards the end of 2013, bizarrely, I ended up joining a network marketing company, of all things, okay, to earn, for me at the time, an extra few £100s a month. £50 a week to me was a lot of money, okay. And I joined this company, didn't even really know what the hell it was or anything else, but when I joined, I could actually see other people in the company earning this like 6-figure income and beyond, and I thought, how are they doing that? I want to learn. Now, I've always been a great student. You know, that's something that, obviously, having a dad who you didn't feel good enough for, absolutely. So actually, you know, some of those negative parts that you would perceive actually has stood me in really good stead. In some, you know, I'm a hard worker. You know, my work ethic is strong because I'm going to prove my worth, kind of thing.
Got it.
So I started to build this business in this company, and within a year I built a team where we were turning over £1 million worth of product, and I built like thousands in my team. I was qualifying for the holidays. I was getting big checks and stuff as well. And don't get me wrong, it was a part of my journey, because there's a lot of personal development involved in network marketing.
There is, yeah. As soon as you said that, I thought, well, then that makes sense.
And that was kind of an inroad. And I was working with a therapist as well at the time. But again, it was a lot of talking. So it's keeping me being re-traumatized with all of that. And again, when you've divorced a narcissist, that doesn't mean, oh, you've divorced now, everything will go back and it'll be okay. No. The abuse escalates when you divorce a narcissist. They'll find other ways of manipulation to get narcissistic supply. So that was all ongoing as well. So there was never let up, so to speak. And because of the trauma bond, I was engaging in all of that as well.
Oh, I hear that so much in other women. I mean, I'm sure you hear the same thing in your groups and your communities. I hear that over and over again. It does get worse, a bit like that. When you leave, it gets worse, and the chances of, unfortunately, talking quite serious, as in murdering, physical abuse, not just the emotional abuse. But for many women that didn't have it severe as that, there is still this ongoing controlling behaviour where they don't feel like they haven't got the same influence anymore. So that some can become quite spiteful.
Because narcissists aren't born like that either. They also have these inner child wounds, and everything for them is again about not feeling that inner child wound. So their parts that show up are abusive parts projecting outwardly onto you to soothe their wound. Now, if you've got a wound, you're going to receive that as a very triggering moment. Obviously I'm not triggered at all by my ex now, because I don't necessarily have that wound. So I'm not receiving his behavior coming then as an activator for my wound. I'm just my true self, so to speak, and I'm not receiving it in that way. He's not changed. My perception of his behavior has changed by processing my trauma.
I really love that, but that leads me to a question. So I'm sorry if I'm going to interrupt you, but I think it's an important one, in that we're talking about separating and moving away from this sort of bad behavior. Is there a situation where you can have a conventional relationship where actually the couples are quite happy, and we're not talking abusive relationship as such, but possibly the behavior at times, because we all have triggers, right? We all have a past, we all have things that we're not aware of. I see a lot of women now getting personal development, and I see that then they're actually having to reframe their relationships with their partners because they've healed their wound, and therefore the relationship has evolved. Do you find the same?
100%. And I think it's for all of us, if we we can't heal what we're not aware of, and everybody has trauma. Trauma isn't just these major life events. Trauma is actually what you say to yourself about your events in your past that then gets stored in the body. So trauma isn't necessarily a car crash. Trauma isn't necessarily narcissistic abuse. It's, trauma for me around narcissistic abuse was his behavior is because I'm not good enough. That was the trauma, not the narcissistic abuse. That's an event, that's a perpetrator, that's somebody, that's why I talk a lot about narcissistic trauma as opposed to narcissistic abuse all the time. Because if we just talk about narcissistic abuse, that's very much about the abuser. Whereas trauma, narcissistic trauma is what you have. But the beauty of trauma is we can heal that because it's in our power, because trauma is about me going, I'm not good enough because of his behavior. So when you say about people having this personal development and everything, as we move through life and we experience these different elements and our own behaviors start to show up, very often we start to think, oh, what's wrong with me? Or what's wrong with them? And actually it should be, well, what happened to me? What happened to them for those parts to show up in the present moment that can be more destructive? Why is that person angry all of the time? Why is that person negative all of the time? Because we're not born like that. No. When we come into this world, we're full of compassion and confidence and clarity and curiosity and creativity. That's who we are. If we're not then coming from that place, we're blended with one of our protector parts because there's a wound that is being triggered in that particular point. And when you're in these relationships, sometimes your partner may be soothing your wound, but then if they have a bad day, then you're going to get triggered and blend with your part, and then that might trigger them. And so you're kind of having these almost like part to part relationships, as opposed to true self relationships. If you have one person who is, and I see this with my husband now, even I can see when he's got a part coming up, I can see when, you know, he's triggered about things.
Does that annoy him? That must annoy him.
Well, I don't kind of give him therapy over it necessarily as such, you know, and I have to be mindful of, you know, I can be very much there feeling like I can feel compassion and curiosity as to his behavior. Doesn't mean I don't feel a part coming up sometimes where I want to speak from my anger part to him or something.
Yeah.
Sometimes it blends and I do get angry at him. But again, I don't judge myself anymore if I'm like that. I know it's a part of me, and I know then there's a wound then that clearly my husband's behavior is maybe just scratch the scab a little bit on it, and I need to go and do some inner work myself. But that's me. But if you think about other relationships, if one person then is doing this personal development and recognizing all of that, it can be highly triggering to somebody else, because you know, they may well feel they're getting left behind. What if they leave me? You know, that there can be so many different parameters, and we're all so different. And this is really driven by our own nervous system with how we are, because we're driven to feel safe. So if we're not safe, we're then in sort of fight, flight, or freeze, and that can show up in these stress responses that we have. You know, fight, flight is often we mobilize more energy, we produce more cortisol, where we're the more anxious. You know, anxiety is a sympathetic trauma response to perception, keyword there, of danger. Often there is no danger, but why am I feeling anxious all the time? Well, that part is coming up to stop you doing something, because your brain thinks if you do that, it's going to rip the scab off your core wound, which is what we mustn't feel. So, you know, it's working always for you, but we know from a cognitive perspective, that's not how many people want to live their lives as well. You know, they want to be happy, but our brain isn't set up to just do that. We have to intentionally work on being happy, wealthy, successful. Our whole system is set up for survival first and foremost. So if we've got a wound from a childhood where it's really painful, it's like our brain in that moment goes, oh my God, this is so painful. Never want you to feel like this again. This is like deep pain, because it will be.
Avoid it at all costs.
Because it will be to a kid, but your system then gets stuck. So again, when I'm working with my clients, you know, we're working really on a stuck, wounded younger part of them. And once we can work on that and change, we don't change events that have happened in the past. We can't do that because it's happened. But we change the experience of those events. So I now, when I think of my childhood, I don't think, oh my God, I'm not good enough and there's a wound there. I can look back with compassion and in my body know, yeah, it was tough the way my dad was and everything. But I now know he didn't do that because of me. He was like that to me because of his stuff.
Yeah.
Now, there's a real difference here between cognitively knowing that, because many listeners will know that maybe about stuff from their childhood.
Yeah. The
difference is you've got to feel it in your body as well. You have to process this through your body. Otherwise, you're still going to be stuck in that loop all the time.
How do people do that? And I'm conscious that we've been talking for like probably longer than I normally do my podcast, and I'm conscious you might even have another meeting that you need to go to. But I'm just going to ask this question anyway. How do you do that? I mean, obviously it sounds like something you'd need to go and get some professional help.
Yeah, I mean, there are things you can do. A lot of grounding work is really important to start with, to bring your brain back into the present moment, front part and everything. I mean, when I work with my clients or in my groups and communities and programs, I use sort of somatic work. So I use things like brain spotting. We map the nervous system. We map what parts of you are showing up. We do brain spotting where we look at eye position to almost unlock parts of the brain where that trauma is. And just, you know, the body has a tremendous capacity to heal when it's given the space to do so.
Yeah, sure.
And also somatic, I've just started in somatic experiencing. So it really is about allowing your body to feel that which it didn't feel in those moments, almost to close that process, to close that loop, so you can look back and remember, as opposed to keep reliving it in the present moment, which is very often what we do as human beings.
And one of the last, maybe second to last questions, before we wrap up. So you've done the trauma work. You know, 2013, you were feeling ashamed and all of that. you're now running a very successful business, helping people through this process and coaching other coaches around how to learn how to do this process as well. And you've got, you know, Facebook followers, podcasts, you know, it's extremely successful business. Do you feel that you, financially speaking, well, you know, I'm a wealth strategist, from your wealth and your growth of yourself, that has happened only through the fact that you've, if you like, what's the right word? And I want to use the right, solved the trauma, that's the wrong word, healed the trauma, let's be a better word.
You can never necessarily heal trauma completely, and I think many people think that it's this destination that we're going to reach. You know, one day you're going to go, I'm healed, great, you know, I can live my life now. You know, for me, healing is an ongoing journey. It's a lifelong journey for me, because I just go deeper, you know, all of the time. And that doesn't mean I don't have bad days, I do, you know, but on the whole, healing for me is recognizing when you dip into those stress responses and how quickly you can get back into feeling present and understanding that you are actually safe in that moment. Because that moment you dip into fight, flight, freeze, you're in a past experience, you're feeling all of those because it hasn't been processed. So for me, healing really is an ongoing process, and I always teach this, because very often if people are putting destinations on things, you're never going to reach it. So then you're always criticizing yourself and not being where you think you should be.
Right.
So it's a much softer approach, that it's just, you know what, every day, today, I'm just going to go with what it is. And if I notice something in my body, then I'm going to work with it. And I know that there's stuff coming up, but I'm not doing this with judgment to myself. It's just compassion, that what amazing human beings we are. And if something does come up for me, then I know then there's something I just need to work on, and I'll go and do work, what that I teach, I'll do it on myself. You know, I walk the walk, talk the talk kind of thing, because I do it to myself. But I think it is important for people to recognize that, you know, if nothing changes, nothing changes. Particularly when we talk about trauma, you know, you could be fine for a week, 2 weeks, 6 months even, but that moment somebody potentially activates what your core wound is, you will react, and you will have those somatic responses that come up as well. So And
do you believe that can hold people back, or do you think that, you know, that drive that you talked about, but possibly people will have a drive, there'll be a certain success and then possibly reach burnout? Is that connected?
Absolutely, because if you're constantly in that fight, flight, freeze all of the time producing cortisol, you know, excess cortisol can lead to a lot of dis-ease, inflammation. This is why we tend to find people with ongoing trauma, even if they think they haven't got it, if they're still running their life being in fight, flight and freeze as such, thyroid issues, liver problems, kidney, digestive issues, you know, skin issues, alopecia. There's so many physical conditions that can then come from that we put down to, I'm just busy mum, or I'm just busy this, but actually
lots of plates, busy. But again, and that's another badge of honor, right? Being busyness. We've all got, and with too many of us have got that.
Adrenals are pumping out this cortisol. No wonder they're shattered, because what they're doing is they are pumping out cortisol in anticipation of the danger your brain thinks you may or may not be in because of your past experiences.
Right.
And of course that's going to lead to burnout. And what happens if we're pumping out cortisol ready to fight, flight and freeze, not because we're actually going to fight or run away, but because we might have anxiety or be angry or dissociated, then by being in that cortisol response, you know, our adrenal glands get tired. And because we're so focused, ready to fight, flight or freeze, it takes away our body processes from things like digesting food. That's why a lot of people will find it may be difficult to lose weight, for instance. You know, it shifts our body away from doing the processes it should be doing naturally on a daily basis.
Got it. Oh my God, I knew this was going to be amazing. And there's so many things I want to talk to you about, but I feel like we should leave it there. And I feel like, tell us, how can we connect with you? And just tell about if you've got anything coming up soon.
Yeah, so connecting with me, social media is always a great place. Instagram, Facebook. I've got a free support group on Facebook, Narcissistic Abuse and Trauma Recovery for Women. You know, I am really passionate about helping people really become trauma informed. I think that's really, really important. And so, you know, I've got coming up an integrated trauma informed coaching certification for people who want to learn how to be more trauma informed in what they're doing as well.
Amazing. Excuse the scratchy noise. Anyone that follows me on Instagram at the moment or Facebook, I currently have a rabbit in my office.
Oh, you can probably hear my dog now as well, because I've just seen the postman come. It's like that little timing. He did time it well at the end of the podcast though.
This is at the end and not interrupting us. The other day I had to take his water bottle away because he's so noisy whilst he's drinking. But he's cute. I'm gradually taming him, that he'll come and sit next to me like an evil cat on my desk or something.
I couldn't have our dog in here. No way. She'd be nosing out the window and barking straight away. Not anybody.
Well, it's been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for joining us today. And obviously go and connect with Caroline. Go and find her group. If it's somebody that you know that you feel that might be in a difficult place, not necessarily in a narcissistic or an abusive relationship, but you feel that they might need some help right now, then go and check out the resources and share it with them. Let them know that they're not alone and that there is help out there. And equally, if something you're going through personally, don't feel like you're alone either. And come and check out. There's many resources. I'm sure that there's podcasts. Your podcast is amazing, Caroline. So go and check it out. Just start the process. It's like you say, Caroline, it's not one immediate. I've personally been through a couple of programs in the last few years myself, and I can see a real difference in myself. The version of me 10 years ago that I described, pregnant, having a baby, and I was made redundant. It was very victim based. My mum left me when I was one, again very victim based. There's a story that I've told myself for many years, and I saw a real change in myself and what I've achieved and how I go about doing my business, how I show up as a mum. It affects everything, I think, that we do. And you've said it beautifully by giving that self-love to yourself first and putting yourself first.
Compassion for the person you were, trying to stay safe and do the best that you could.
Exactly. Loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.